We have another mystery here at the museum, and I need you to help me solve it. And this one, shall we say, is a royal pain in the... Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars, each one with a different story. Some very simple, some very fast, and some, like this car right here, very luxurious. This is a 1933 Buick Series 90 limousine with special custom coachwork. We'll talk about all that in just a moment, but first, if you are enjoying these videos, make sure you like and subscribe, and I definitely want to hear your comments on this particular car during this video because I need to solve some mysteries associated with this. I think you are the person who can help me. But before we talk too much about this particular car, we have to talk about Buick. Buick was founded in 1899 as the Buick Auto Vim and Power Company by David Dunbar Buick. It was in Detroit, Michigan. Now, initially he was focusing just on engine design, but somewhat reluctantly he decided to shift to automobile production and was reorganized as the Buick Motor Company in 1903. But just the next year, they were already having some financial difficulties. So Buick came under the control of William Durant, a very savvy businessman who saw its potential. That same year, Buick released its first production car, the Model B, which featured an innovative overhead valve engine. Durant also used this company as the cornerstone for General Motors. Of course, the concept behind General Motors was that it was a series of different brands, each designed to appeal to a different automotive audience, from Chevrolet all the way up to Cadillac. And the Buick, well, it was designed to slot in right below Cadillac at that point in time, the second most luxurious car that they had to offer. But let's go back and think about the 1930s. You know, it was a pretty difficult time right after the Depression. I mean, for some people, just buying food was a luxury. The concept of buying a luxury car, well, that was even more difficult, just a distant dream, even for those who had been driving luxury cars just a few years before. But for those who were still living well, who did have some money, the 1933 Buick Series 90 was a car that balanced both luxury and subtlety. Now, it was not as flashy as a Cadillac, at least that's what some people would say. Let's just say it offered the quiet sophistication that suited the taste of, let's call it, the modestly wealthy crowd. It didn't scream about its status, instead it just whispered it. And that, for many people, was exactly what they needed at that period in time. Now, the Series 90 had its root in what we call the GMC C-body platform. It shared that with the Cadillac Series 355. But don't think this was just a Cadillac clone, a knockoff if you want to call it. In fact, it was actually different in a lot of different ways, very special in its own right. In fact, under the hood, it has a Buick engine, a 345 cubic inch straight 8. We'll talk about that in just a moment, which provide just enough power, in fact, a lot of low-end torque to get this 4,700-pound vehicle, which was the base limousine without special coach work, going on a road back then. Because remember, it wasn't about top speed, it was just about getting up and moving as smoothly as possible. Remember, it was a luxury car. It's all about comfort and not all-out performance. Now, one of the things that really set the Series 90 apart was its refinement. Inside, you were going to be treated to the finest of everything. But this particular car right here takes that up a notch higher. That's because this has special coach work that was put together by a company called Bronkhorst. And that is going to be our first mystery. Because I know a few things about Bronkhorst, but to be honest with you, not very much. The one thing I know right off the bat is that they were in the Netherlands. They were a Dutch coach building company. Now, you have to remember, back in those days, coach builders were very common. They would take a chassis or a rolling chassis with some portion of the vehicle on it, and then they would add additional coach work. We've heard about that from Fleetwood and other companies, especially overseas. There were a lot of them in Europe and Great Britain at that point in time, and they could do amazing things with the cars that they were given. This particular one, Bronkhorst, once again, was apparently a Dutch builder, and apparently in the early 1900s, they received a royal commission by Queen Wilhemina to start building coachwork limousines on Buick chassis for the royal family. Now, later on, they kind of expanded. I believe there were some brothers involved in it. They expanded, and they were building a number of things, including funeral coaches. What we're going to have to figure out with this car is why it was built this way, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But if you know more about Bronkhorst, if you know more about that coach building company from the Netherlands, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to learn more about Bronkhorst and the car and the vehicle right here that they created. 1933 was a pretty significant year for Buick and the Series 90. This line came out in 1931, but for 1933 there were a lot of changes, significantly right up front, right off the bat. The previous years had a flatter grille, which was pretty much the standard within the industry. For 1933, you can see they've gone to this sort of V shape that comes out right here to give it a lot more style. Another significant thing that happened in 1933 was they changed the frame in such a way that not only did they strengthen it with an X frame across the bottom, but they also allowed the car's body to ride lower on the chassis, so it gave it a lower center of gravity. I love all the little touches. For example, this was the first year they used this handle right here. This is for releasing the hood. You simply pull up on it, and then that gives you access to that. Up until that point, they had a couple of them where you would pull them out from the outside, move them off to the side. These, of course, are simply for venting the engine on a nice hot day. You had the ability to vent it as little or as much as you wanted with all those. One of the little styling touches I love is this right here. This is the spare wheel that is mounted on the side. There's one actually on either side. But look at the elegance of the device used to release it. This handle up here where you would simply release that, and then of course you can see the tire in here with this case over the outside. So it's just a lovely touch, and you'll notice it is a what we call full-size spare, right? With a real wheel underneath. So if you were driving along, no one would know you had switched to the spare. As I mentioned, the body was allowed to ride lower on the chassis. This is a 138-inch wheelbase, but that also allowed for a lower running board, which made it easier to get access to the car. Now, this particular one has been done up with a lot of extra touches. You'll notice this cane work that's been inserted right here. You can also see what is the supposed royal crest, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. When you look up above, you really have to notice the fact that this is a cloth top all the way from front to back, because the ability to build a long, flat piece of metal that would go across the roof was very, very difficult. So the norm, the standard back in those days, was to use cloth all the way from front to back, and normally there were pieces of wood underneath that formed the frame for it. I love the fact that it's got these things right here, these hinges on the outside, and all kinds of little elegant touches, the way the handles work right here. And I'll give you a brief glimpse inside, but we'll take you inside in just a moment. This is the royal look, shall we say. But once again, beautiful car. This is a coach built by Bronkhorst. This is not the way a standard limousine would have looked. Standard limousine, quite frankly, would have had a different style of body. Similar, but once again, coming out of the Buick factory, not nearly as elegant or, well, as splashy as this one. Raising the hood on this Buick is a little bit tricky. Now, I showed you that handle, the new handle they came up with in 1933, but the thing you have to remember is when you pull that, you can't just pull out on it. What you actually have to do is kind of push in on the hood and pull up at the same time, starting to flip it over to the other side. This particular one has a little rubber section right here that you can kind of squeeze in right here, and that gives you access to the hood without having to worry about whether it's going to flip all the way over. Once you got the engine open, that's when you could see this great Fireball 8 Buick engine. Now, this originally came out in 1931. They actually used some version of this engine all the way up through 1953 before the V8s began to take over in the General Motors world. They had three different engines that you could buy. The base engine had 230 cubic inches. I think it was good for about a whopping 86 horsepower. They had a 272 cubic inch version of this. That was good for 96 horsepower. Or you could get the big one, 345 cubic inches that could pump out 113 horsepower. Now remember, I mentioned that this car weighed 4,700 pounds, and that's before we put the special coachwork on it. So you can imagine it, once again, didn't have tremendous performance, but the beauty of this engine is it had a fair amount of what they call low-end torque, the ability to get moving from a standing start. So it wasn't about the high speed, it was about the smooth acceleration, which is exactly what they would want. It did have overhead valves, and you can't see them right here, but there's a valve cover up above that allowed the overhead valves to be able to pop in as opposed to an L head. At that point, a lot of cars had the L head, which was off to the side, although Chevrolet by that point had introduced the overhead valves as well in 1929. It's got a torque tube with going out the back. That's how the drive shaft goes through a torque tube getting to the rear end. It also goes through a 3-speed semi-automatic transmission, and of course it's got a single carburetor that pumps all the air into this with this cool looking air cleaner right here. I can tell you there's not a lot of room up here. You look between the distance between the back of the engine and the front, and boy, it is just about as tight as it can ask for right here. That's one of the beauties when they eventually went to the V8 engine. The ability to cram a large engine in a smaller space was pretty significant, because when you've got 8 cylinders in a row with 345 cubic inches, that makes this a fairly long engine. But again, it was very effective and did exactly what they needed it to do back in those days. Well, my experience with 1933 Buicks is rather limited. The driver's compartment for this one does look a little different to me, and I'll explain why. And I think this was done because they needed to expand the area in the back. And after all, this was just for the driver. He was secondary. But in a 1933 Buick, they were very proud of the fact that they had moved the gauges so that they were just above the steering wheel. So as the driver was driving along, he could look up, look out, and just glance down at his gauges. Here, we have them off to the side. As you can see that they're sitting here in this little metal-shaped thing off to the side so that he would have to look down. And I think the reason they've done this is in expanding the back, they've actually moved the seat for the driver just a little bit more forward. And to do that, they also had to raise the steering wheel. So the steering column is probably at a higher elevation. This had to go up, and in doing so, they had to eliminate the gauges that would have been right behind it. I think they also had a glove compartment right here, an early glove compartment that was built into the dash as opposed to what we were used to. Another thing that's happened with this, and as I look forward, I don't see it, and I think this is another reason that they had to make some changes. In 1933, they were very proud of their no-draft ventilation system, which was actually a little device on the cowl that popped up and allowed the air to come into the compartment for the passengers. And when I look at the cowl on this car, that is absolutely missing. So I think what they did was to get a couple extra inches in the back for the people in the luxury section of this vehicle. They had to make changes up front that just took a little bit away from the driver's compartment, because to be honest with you, it's actually very short. You can see my knees are popped up right here. It's a little more difficult to drive, I think, but going back to my point, this wasn't about driver comfort. This was about comfort for people in the back. Climbing into the back, we get into the luxury section. This is, of course, for the paying customers back here, the people with all the money. And trust me, there was plenty of room for any kind of elegance that you needed to cruise along to. But this is where I'm going to bring up the next mystery, the biggest mystery. The question of who this car was built for. As I mentioned, Bronkhorst was a coach builder in the Netherlands, and in the early 1900s was actually commissioned to build limousines for Queen Wilhemina, who was the Queen of the Netherlands. Now this one has been purported to be a car that was built for Queen Wilhelmina. It has the royal crest on the outside. But I've also seen research that said this was not built for Queen Wilhelmina, that this one was built simply to be a funeral vehicle. Now, it was a very upscale funeral vehicle, but it was used for funerals. Now, inside, it is black everywhere. As you'll notice, the black seats, the black tuck behind me, a little threadbare. I'm curious if this is the original. It has these gray poles to allow you to get in and out, so I could see how this is something that might be used as a funeral vehicle. On the other hand, it also has something that simply would be elegant for a member of a royal family. And I noticed, by the way, in the glass just above me right here, this little light, well, it has the tulip emblem in it. But I've seen some people write about this exact vehicle saying that this was used by the royal family. But I've seen other people writing about this exact vehicle saying, no, this was never used. So this is where I need your help. And I know we actually have quite a few people watching in the Netherlands. We have an international channel. We've got people from all over the world who watch this. And I know, by the way, hello Australia. I know you folks on New Zealand and Australia watch on a regular basis. But one of our top 10 countries watching our channel is from the Netherlands. So if there's someone in the Netherlands that knows the answer to this question, I'd love to know it. Is there a picture of Queen Wilhelmina riding in this vehicle in a parade? Or was it simply used as a funeral vehicle? By the way, one cool thing about the Martin Auto Museum, not only do we let you get up close to the cars, most of them are not roped off, we actually let you get into, well, quite a few of them. I think at least half of them here at the museum. That means you could actually sit in the back of this royal limousine and feel like the royal family of the Netherlands, or at the very least, somebody going to a very expensive funeral. All right, automotive sleuths, have at it. Was this indeed the royal coach for Queen Wilhelmina? Did she sit in the back as she was being driven around the Netherlands? Or was this simply, and I almost hate to say simply, but simply a funeral coach for the very wealthy in the Netherlands back in those days? Something that would have driven around, well, the elite to the funeral for a loved one. And to be honest with you, I can make a case for either way. There is some research that shows that Queen Wilhelmina did use a Buick limousine at one point in time, although I think it was an earlier one. And I can also make a case as for why she would have gone with a Buick, for example. It'd be a little less ostentatious than having a Rolls Royce or a Cadillac back in those days. After all, it was the Netherlands. They weren't the biggest country in the world, although they sometimes acted like they were in the earlier era. But I can also make a case for why she would have gone for something nicer, flashier. Now, it was the 1930s, it was the Depression, but still, the fact that she was the queen, she had to reflect those regal airs. And I've seen research from previous owners or people who talk to previous owners that raise some questions about whether this was indeed the royal coach, and they don't seem to be able to find any specific proof, honestly, one way or the other. So that's why I want you to get involved. I want you to figure out, was this indeed the royal coach for Queen Wilhelmina, or was it not? Have at it, ladies and gentlemen. We need to know the answer.